The first signal of a real shift is rarely change. It's the moment you stop caring the way you used to. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. The life you once defended no longer feels worth protecting. The goals that once dictated your choices lose their urgency. The identity you worked so hard to maintain starts to feel optional. Nothing is wrong. What's happening is more subtle than failure or confusion. You're not rejecting your past, and you're not chasing something new yet. You're simply no longer anchored to the version of life that once felt necessary. This is where most people misunderstand the moment. They assume they're stuck. They search for motivation, clarity, or inspiration to feel normal again. But what's actually happening is far more precise. The internal structure holding your reality together isn't collapsing. It's loosening. And when that loosening begins, reality becomes editable. Long before anything external changes. Neurologically, this is what occurs when emotional charge detaches from habitual thought loops. Old predictions stop working. Certainty fades. Direction feels suspended. Spiritually, this phase has always been recognized as a threshold, a point where the old identity can no longer carry the future forward. Yet the new one hasn't fully arrived. Different languages. Same experience. What makes this stage so confusing is its quiet nature. There's no breakdown to point to. No dramatic ending. Just a growing neutrality toward what once defined you. And that neutrality isn't emptiness. It's space. Space that didn't exist before. Space where a different version of reality can begin organizing itself. This is why real quantum shifts don't start with visible action. They begin with an internal release so subtle most people dismiss it. But once that release starts, returning to the old way of being feels strangely impossible, even if nothing outside has changed yet. And this is only the beginning. What follows is a precise internal sequence, often misunderstood, that determines whether this moment becomes a temporary pause or a true jump into a new timeline. Most people feel these shifts without recognizing them. A few sense that something irreversible has started, and few still understand how to move through what comes next without collapsing back into the familiar. That's where the real process begins. Once indifference replaces attachment, something else begins to shift quietly. Your internal state, not your thoughts, not your plans, your baseline, the way your body holds tension, the way emotions rise and fall, the way you respond before you have time to think. This is where most people lose the plot because they expect reality to change first. But in every real quantum jump, the order is reversed. You may notice that reactions soften. Situations that once triggered urgency or defensiveness no longer hook you in the same way. There's a strange neutrality that settles in. Not coldness, not apathy, just less friction. The nervous system stops, bracing for impact. And when that happens, perception itself changes. You're still in the same environment, but it doesn't land on you the same way anymore. From a biological perspective, this is a shift in autonomic regulation. The body moves out of chronic survival mode and into coherence. Heart rhythm stabilizes. Stress hormones decrease. The system stops scanning for threat and starts conserving energy. When the body exits survival, the mind loses its obsession with control. That's why clarity doesn't arrive yet. Clarity belongs to stability, not transition. Spiritually, this is the moment where frequency changes before form. Long before circumstances rearrange, the internal signal becomes cleaner. Less noise, less contradiction. The field responds to this immediately, even if the reflection takes time to appear. This is where people confuse patience with stagnation. Nothing looks like it's happening yet. Everything important already has. What's deceptive about this phase is how ordinary it feels. There's no rush of excitement, no emotional high. If anything, life feels simpler, quieter, almost boring compared to the internal chaos you used to live in. But that quiet is not emptiness. It's coherence. And coherence is what allows probabilities to collapse cleanly, instead of scattering across timelines. This is also why forcing positivity or visualization during this phase often feels off. The system isn't asking for stimulation. It's asking for consistency. Every time you respond calmly where you once reacted, the signal strengthens. Every time you Choose presence over prediction, the new state stabilizes further. You're teaching your body what reality it belongs in. Now you might catch yourself pausing more before speaking, choosing differently without rehearsing, reasons letting things pass without interpretation. These are not small changes. They're evidence that your internal state is no longer organized around the old identity. And once the body leads, the mind eventually follows. The mistake is trying to rush this part. People assume something has gone wrong because nothing dramatic is happening. They abandon the shift right here, reaching back for familiar emotional intensity just to feel something recognizable again. But intensity isn't movement. It's repetition. Real movement feels subtler than that. This internal state shift is what allows the next phase to unfold. Without it, action feels forced. With it, movement becomes almost inevitable. Not impulsive, inevitable. Because once the body is no longer aligned with the past, staying still begins to feel heavier than stepping forward. And that's when the third shift begins. Not as a plan, but as motion without guarantees. After your internal state stabilizes, something subtle but decisive happens. Staying still begins to feel heavier than moving. Not because you suddenly feel confident, but because hesitation no longer feels aligned. This is where the third internal shift emerges, movement without guarantees. And this is the point where most people either change timelines or retreat. The actions that arise here don't look strategic. They often don't make sense to the version of you that needed proof. Before acting, they're small sometimes, quiet, sometimes inconvenient. A conversation you stop avoiding. A decision you make without rehearsing. Every outcome. A boundary you set without explaining yourself. These moves aren't dramatic enough to feel like transformation, yet they carry disproportionate weight because they break continuity with the old pattern. From the brain's perspective, this is how new timelines become neurologically viable. Action introduces new sensory feedback. New feedback interrupts prediction. And when prediction fails, the mind becomes flexible. This is why intention alone rarely produces a quantum jump. The nervous system needs evidence that a different future is being lived, even if only in fragments. Movement supplies that evidence. Spiritually, this is the moment faith becomes practical, not as belief, but as obedience to a quiet internal signal. You don't move because you're sure it will work. You move because not moving feels dishonest to who you're becoming. This distinction matters. Action rooted in fear still belongs to the old timeline. Action rooted in alignment creates a rupture. What makes this phase uncomfortable is the lack of external reinforcement. Reality hasn't caught up yet. There's no confirmation, no applause, sometimes not even relief. Just a strange sense that something has been set in motion. This is where people second-guess themselves, replay decisions, and look backward for validation. But validation comes later, always later, because reality responds after coherence, not before. You might notice resistance surfacing here, not from the outside, but internally. Old thoughts question the timing. Old identities ask for logic. Old habits try to reassert control. This isn't failure. It's friction between timelines. The old structure senses that continuity has been broken and tries to restore it. Whether it succeeds depends on what happens next. If you continue moving from this place, not impulsively, but consistently, the signal strengthens. The field begins reorganizing around the new pattern. Opportunities don't appear yet, but pathways do. Options that didn't exist before become visible. Not because the world changed, but because your perception did. This is the point where people say everything started shifting after that one decision. They rarely recognize it at the time. It only becomes obvious in hindsight once the timeline has fully collapsed. But the collapse doesn't start with a miracle. It starts with motion that breaks repetition. Still, this phase isn't complete on its own. Movement opens the door, but something else determines whether you walk through it or turn back. Because once the old structure loses stability, discomfort increases. And how you relate to that discomfort decides everything. That's where the fourth shift waits. Not as a test, but as a threshold. Once movement breaks the old pattern, discomfort intensifies. Not because you made a mistake, but because the structure that used to hold your reality together has lost stability. This is the phase most people mislabel as anxiety, confusion, or self-doubt. In truth, it's friction between identities. The old one hasn't fully released. The new one hasn't fully embodied yet, and the nervous system is caught between them. What makes this phase dangerous isn't the discomfort itself. It's how tempting it is to interpret that discomfort as a sign to stop. The mind looks for familiar explanations. It asks whether you moved too fast, whether you misunderstood the signal, whether you should go back and think things through. But thinking was never the issue. The discomfort appears precisely because thinking no longer has the authority it used to. From a physiological standpoint, this is a liminal state. The brain dislikes ambiguity. It craves resolution, even if that resolution means returning to something limiting, but familiar. That's why the urge to retreat feels so rational here. The system wants certainty, not expansion. And certainty is always easier to find in the past than in the future. Spiritually, this moment has been described across traditions as the crossing, the place where the old self loses leverage. There's often a strange mix of calm and unease, a sense that something important is happening paired with the fear of not knowing what comes next. This combination confuses people because they assume clarity should arrive before peace. In reality, peace often arrives first. Clarity follows later. This is where many quantum jumps collapse quietly, not with failure, but with self-interruption. People override the process by reintroducing urgency, distraction, or excessive analysis. They mistake discomfort for danger instead of recognizing it as the natural pressure that accompanies expansion. Growth doesn't feel like improvement in real time. It feels like instability. What matters here is tolerance, not endurance. Tolerance, the ability to stay present without rushing to resolve the feeling, the ability to let the nervous system recalibrate without forcing meaning onto the experience. Every time you don't react the way you used to, the old timeline weakens. Further, every time you remain with the sensation instead of escaping it, the new one stabilizes. This is also where external validation becomes irrelevant. Other people may not see what's happening. Some may even question your choices. That doesn't mean you're off track. It means you've stepped outside a shared pattern. When you move between realities, you temporarily lose the language that made your old life legible to others. If you pass through this phase without collapsing backward, something important happens next. Space opens. Not conceptually, physically, emotionally, cognitively. The grip loosens. The effort drops. The sense of holding everything together fades. And that's when the fifth shift begins. Not as loss, but as release. After discomfort loosens its grip, something subtle but unmistakable follows. Effort drops. Not because everything is resolved, but because you're no longer holding the same internal weight. This is the fifth shift, the moment where release happens. Naturally, not through discipline or decision, but because there's nothing left to carry. In the same way, expectations soften. Old attachments lose urgency. You stop managing outcomes and start allowing responses. This phase is often misunderstood as loss because things fall away without drama. Habits you once relied on no longer fit. Certain conversations stop repeating themselves. Some desires simply don't come with you. But what's actually happening is capacity returning. When the internal system is no longer overloaded with maintenance, space opens. Cognitively, emotionally, energetically. And space is what reality needs in order to move. From a neurological perspective, this is where cognitive load decreases. Fewer competing narratives, less internal friction. The brain shifts from constant prediction to receptive awareness. That change alone alters perception. You start noticing possibilities that were always there but never registered because attention was consumed elsewhere. Opportunity doesn't appear suddenly. It becomes visible. Spiritually, this is where the field responds more cleanly. When you're no longer broadcasting mixed signals, feedback accelerates synchronicities. Increase, timing sharpens, things begin to line up without force. This is the phase people later describe as everything just started flowing, even though the groundwork was laid much earlier during moments that felt far less impressive. What's important here is restraint. This is where many people rush to refill the space they've just created. They grab new goals too quickly. They look for meaning to assign. They try to explain what's happening before it has fully settled. But this space is functional. It's the buffer that allows the final shift to occur. Because when enough space exists, alignment happens almost automatically. The sixth shift doesn't feel like effort at all. It feels like recognition. Choices stop being debated internally. You begin responding to life from a place that already knows where it's going, even if you can't articulate how. Decisions come faster, cleaner, with less explanation required. Not because you figured everything out, because the future has started pulling more strongly than the past ever did. This is future self-alignment in its most practical form. Not visualization, not imagination, but obedience to a pattern that's already forming. You don't wait for confirmation anymore. You move as if continuity has already been established, because internally it has. The timeline begins collapsing around that assumption. And this is where people look back and say the jump happened all at once. In reality, it was the result of every internal shift leading up to this point. Identity loosened. State changed. Movement broke repetition. Discomfort was tolerated. Space was created. Alignment locked in. What happens next isn't magic, it's momentum. Once the future becomes the dominant reference point, reality reorganizes with surprising speed. Not because you forced it, because nothing inside you is resisting it anymore. And when resistance disappears, the field doesn't hesitate. That's the moment people call a quantum jump. Most people don't fail at a quantum jump because they lack discipline or belief. They fail because they don't recognize the phase they're in. They mistake dissolution for regression. They rush clarity before coherence. And without realizing it, they interrupt a process that was already working. What you've just moved through isn't theory. It's a sequence. And once you've crossed certain internal thresholds, there's no real way to unknow them. The only question that remains is how you stabilize what's already shifting so it doesn't fade the moment life speeds up again. This is where many people slip back into old timelines, not because they wanted to, but because the nervous system seeks familiarity under pressure. When identity is in transition, structure matters, not rigid structure, grounding. Structure, something that helps the mind and body recognize the new pattern as home. That's why quantum rebirth exists. It was created for this exact moment, when the old way no longer fits and the new one hasn't fully settled yet. It's designed to help you understand what's changing internally, how to move through this transition without rushing or second-guessing, and how to stabilize a new sense of self before the external world fully reflects it. Alongside it, the Quantum Grimoire offers a practical way to anchor this shift day by day, through conscious writing, symbolic focus, and simple grounding practices. It helps translate internal coherence into something repeatable, so the jump doesn't remain a moment, but becomes a baseline. If this video resonated, it's likely because you're already in motion, not searching, not waiting, just moving through a threshold that doesn't announce itself loudly. Nothing here needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be rushed. The shift has already begun.